Welcome to Accessibility and Usability, the Equality of Experience. I want you to go ahead, if you want to follow along later, go ahead and take out your phones, get them ready, because we're going to have a URL and we're going to have a QR code for you in just a minute. There we go. My name is Amber Wilkes.
And I'm Dr. Becca Green.
And we're actually team members on the user experience team. So my background is actually in design, and I've been with Cerner about 4 years now. Almost 4 years. And I've been making solutions accessible since about 2008.
And I'm a researcher. In fact, my PhD is in human factors. And I've been working on accessible products since about 2006.
All right, so you got your phones ready? You can QR code it up, or you can go to the URL. I used bit.ly, because everybody's familiar, so go http:// bit.ly/071416.
Today's date.
It's today's date, yeah. So if you guys want to follow along with a transcript to our talk today. So you guys got it? We're good? bit.ly/071416. Okay. So we are here today to talk about accessibility and usability, kind of shed some light on it. We want to start off by first saying that just because something is accessible doesn't mean it's usable. And just because it's usable doesn't mean it's accessible. And so why is this important? Well, because a lot of people, when they talk about accessibility and usability, they think that they're the same thing, when they're actually not. But before we actually talk about what accessibility is, let's talk about what it isn't. And to do that, we're going to cover some pretty common myths about accessibility that we've heard teams and other people say in the past.
So the first myth that we kind of hear all the time is accessibility, it's just all about screen readers and alt tags, when in fact, there are more ways of accessing the content than just through a screen reader. See, the variety of assistive technologies is just numerous. The US Census, in fact, indicates that visual disabilities are just a small slice of the population with disabilities.
So even though it gets a lot of attention, it's still a very small subset of the disabled population. So myth number 2 is that you don't need content to design, when in fact, users are coming for information. I mean, when was the last time you went to a restaurant's website to access the pretty pictures?
I go for the hours.
I always go for the menu or the location. I can't find my way around Kansas City still. So as a designer, when we are challenged with creating a layout with no content, we use a bunch of lorem ipsum, some fake Greek copy, and we put in really pretty images, and we get it all formatted, and it looks beautiful, until we dump in the actual real content, which breaks because without the content originally, it's a completely unrealistic design. And it also creates this expectation that content is kind of secondary to the design, when in fact, it's the most integral part. And usability tests actually prove that if you have high quality content, you're going to have higher usability scores.
So another one that we hear is that accessibility is this minefield that's really scary to navigate, when in fact, it's simply a blend of legislation and regulation that aims to eliminate the barriers of technology for people with disabilities.
So what do we mean when we say disability? Well, it's kind of big and broad. So we want to cover all of the different pieces that exist within disability. So it's going to be vision and hearing disability, seizure disorders, cognitive disorders, and limited mobility. And in 2014, there were 37.9 million people in the United States alone with one of these disabilities. It makes up about 12.6% of our population, or about 1 in every 10 people.
So if you look down your row, that means that there's likely that one person in each row has some form of disability. It wasn't that long ago in our recent history that there were no laws for accessibility in the US. In fact, disabilities, particularly cognitive disabilities, were not well understood, and they were frequently categorized as sick and placed in mental institutions or convalescent hospitals. So I want to start off with a story that made a big impact. Some of you might not know about Rosemary Kennedy. She was the oldest sister of John F. Kennedy, yes, that 35th president. She was described as absolutely beautiful with a gorgeous smile. However, there were complications in her birth that made her probably a little less academic and athletic than her siblings. And as she grew older, she demonstrated behavioral problems that her family looked everywhere to help her with. So some doctors suggested a technique that had only been performed about 80 times, which was a prefrontal lobotomy. As you might guess, it failed and left her permanently incapacitated, and she spent the rest of her life in a mental institution with little contact from her family.
It's absolutely heartbreaking.
It is probably for this reason that her sister Eunice began the Special Olympics in 1962.
It's kind of a nice kind of wrap up, the kind of background of why we have the Special Olympics. It's really kind of touching, I think.
You know, it wasn't that long ago, in 1963, that American Standards Association, or ANSI, created the first documented standards for physically handicapped people in buildings.
So no, but the ANSI Standards Association, are those like a regulatory body within the government?
They're a standards organization, kind of like ISO.
Okay.
And it took 10 long years for 49 states to adopt these standards before the federal government jumped in and created the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which provided opportunities to prohibit discriminating against individuals with disabilities. It's only been within our lifetime that the government has funded initiatives for assistive technology. And recently, additional government regulations such as the American Disabilities Act, or ADA, which some of you might know as being the way that they prohibit from discriminating on employment for like race, color, religion. And it's only been recently that they provided an amendment to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 called Section 508. Section 508 prohibits discrimination in terms of assistive technology in information technology. In fact, Section 508 is one of two different types of guidelines. The other one is the Web Content Accessibility Group, WCAG. And so I'm going to give you a couple of differences between these two. Starting off, Section 508 spans across multiple different information technology groups.
Whereas WCAG primarily covers just the web.
Section 508 doesn't have levels or ratings associated with it.
Whereas WCAG actually does. It has your single A, your double A, and your triple A.
Section 508 is U.S. legislation, which means that it's U.S.-based.
And WCAG is independent guidelines for universal design, which actually impacts global. So Section 508 and WCAG are just two little bitty pieces to a larger landscape of all the legislation and regulation that exist that then make up accessibility.
So now that we've talked about what accessibility isn't, let's talk about what accessibility is. It's the degree to which a device, service, or environment is made available to everyone. Usability, on the other hand, is the ease of use and learnability of a product or software. Usability and accessibility together, with the addition of research, empathy, and design, creates a product that is usable by everyone.
And for the first time in human history, computers and technology really make it possible for us to make everything accessible to everyone. And so we'll take the WCG as kind of an example. As their regulations have kind of evolved, so has their organization of all of the content. They've organized it into these kind of 4 principles. And it turns out that the majority of the legislation and regulation that exists out there can all be lumped up into the same kind of tenet principles. So principle number 1 is that your content must be perceivable.
Principle number 2 is that interface elements in the content must be operable.
Principle number 3 is that content and controls must be understandable.
And number 4, that content must be robust enough to work with future and current technologies.
So together we have perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Or?
Poor. What a poor acronym.
It's kind of lame, but you're not going to forget it. So let's start on with our first principle. Information and UI components must be presented in ways users can perceive without losing information or structure. So what does that mean? Basically that we need to meet the users where they are. So we do that by making sure that our content is distinguishable and making sure that we provide alternative forms of content.
So you're probably thinking, how do we make our content distinguishable?
Well, we do that by color and contrast, and text zoom. So most of you probably work with clinical solutions, and whenever we think about our clinical users, we don't necessarily have to compensate with our solutions for any kind of a physical handicap, because a doctor, a surgeon is going to be able to see, right? And a nurse is going to be able to lift, 50 pounds. So when we think about disabilities, it's almost like we kind of shut off and we don't think that it applies for our clinical solutions. But just because our clinicians don't have physical disabilities, it doesn't mean that they can't fall victim to other disabilities. I mean, they're not immune. And in fact, the British Journal of General Practice did a survey of physicians, male physicians, and found that the rate of color deficiency in the male physician population was very similar to that of the general population, so about 8%. So what does it mean for color deficiency? If we are leveraging colors to communicate patient status and only colors, it actually becomes very dangerous because the user can't necessarily distinguish the difference between the two.
This is important that some folks don't even realize that they're color deficient until much later in life. In fact, I didn't even know that my father had a color deficiency until I was much older. In fact, he has one of the most common, deuteranopia.
Which is the green deficiency, right?
Right.
So that's why red and green when you start thinking about colorblind, you immediately think of red and green. It's definitely the most common. But it's really important to understand that it's not just about like two colors. Anybody with a color deficiency, the entire spectrum of colors get lumped down into basically two buckets. So you don't really have that full spectrum or scope of colors to leverage. That's why on the user experience side, we always start with either an icon or a textual reference to communicate a concept, and color is just kind of the added whipped cream on top. So always start with the content, and then you can use color as the extra.
So not only do we need to pay attention to distinguishable content in terms of color and contrast, but also text zoom. 8.1 million people in the US have some form of vision disability. And that's why in March 2013, WebAIM did a survey of individuals with low vision, and they found that screen readers were not the most common assistive technology. In fact, the bulk of it, as you can see from this, was around text size. So what is text zooming? Text zooming is a method that they use to scale text size up and down within a view. So successful text zooming is when the content uniformly scales up and down with maintaining the content that was originally displayed. Unsuccessful zooming is when at 200% the content, text, or images are obscured, clipped, or truncated.
So as the user is zooming in and out of the content, make sure that it actually all stays there.
Yes, it needs to stay the same.
So the other piece is alternative content. And it is just that. It's providing alternative forms of content that actually support all of the senses.
So that means that when you have visual content, you also need to provide audio content. And when you have audio content, you need to provide a textual supplement. That's why we've included this text version of our transcript for you today. So as I mentioned earlier, visual disabilities are just a small slice of the population. Well, hearing disabilities aren't that much more. That's why it's so interesting that hearing disabilities are employed 10% more than those with visual disabilities.
I've always actually found this stat really interesting whenever I first got into accessibility. And I was like, well, why? It seems really unfair. Why are people with vision disabilities less likely to be employed than those with hearing disabilities?
Probably because there's much more support in the deaf community. One of the ways that they support alternative content is through captioning, which is the transcript of speech and sound effects, not to be confused with subtitling, which is a translation of dialogue. These two working together, though, for the deaf community is really important and very powerful because it provides nuances that they might not otherwise get. So it's really important that you meet the users where they are.
Our second principle tells us that UI components in the content must be operable, which I know it sounds like, okay, so it just must work, but it actually means that the UI cannot require an interaction that a user can't perform. How many of you remember Adobe Flash? I know Apple's trying to kill it, but Adobe Flash was still kind of it was the hotness back in the early 2000s. Do you remember?
It was all the rage.
Homestar Runner, anybody? Homestarrunner.com, yes. Well, the problem with Flash is that it requires a mouse interaction. And most assistive technologies out there actually function like a keyboard, so Flash sites are inherently inaccessible.
That's why it's also important for our content to provide navigational markers so that they can be mental points in understanding the complexity of the content. That's why I'm going to share with you a really popular website, Universal Studios. I'm going to share with you their navigation in form of read by one of the second most popular screen readers, NVDA.
I'm ready.
Landmark Universal Studios Hollywood visit Parkhouse link Parkhouse heading level 3. Pass member info link. Note search complimentary landmark submit button. Navigation landmark list with 5 items. Plan your visit visited link. Plan your visit. Upgrade to VIP experience link. Explore attractions. Buy tickets link.
Becca, that was awful.
Yeah, it skipped locations within the navigation. It wasn't very descriptive of what they were. We can also see this when we navigate just through the links of this website. It's almost as bad.
Elements list dialog. Tree view. Now open. Type. Links radio button check alt plus K. Tree view. Now fast and the walk.
Oh my gosh, okay, I can't listen to that anymore.
Well, you saw that there was like duplicated links, like now open. That means that the user probably has to go digging for the information.
Yeah, I mean, everything is duplicated. Like, how are they supposed to know which one is an actual link to the page or why the duplications are even there?
That's why it's so important to be very descriptive with your link names. And as you might guess, the list of accessibility problems with this website is like a mile long.
So probably a good key rule of thumb is that if you can't navigate with the keyboard through a website, it's probably not accessible, right?
Probably not. That's why it's so important to give the user control.
So we're giving the user control, like period. Like just they get the control of everything.
Right.
Well, it's not just about inputs, though, or navigating through links. It's about motion as well. Motion, timers, animation, and video. So say you have a dialog window with a countdown timer, like say you're in your bill pay and your authentication on your bank site starts to kind of count down. It's not just users with limited mobility that would have difficulty reaching over and getting to the OK button or the refresh button in time. We also have to account for users with dyslexia, ADHD, short-term memory, and cognitive delays that would prevent them from possibly reading and comprehending the content as fast as they needed to be able to. It's also important to think that even the most innocent patterns can actually have a really bad effect on some users. So accessibility is really personal to me, and that's because I have epilepsy. And I used to work at a company that their front office had wallpaper that was black and white stripes, these vertical, like crazy wallpaper pieces. And I stared too long at the wallpaper one day, and the optical illusion of the high contrast of the stripes actually caused me to have a seizure. And we had talked about how accessibility first started with building codes, right, with ANSI.
Yes.
Obviously, I don't know if ANSI covers vertical striped wallpaper. It might be easy to maybe ban it from a design community instead.
Not to mention the bad interior design.
Yeah, but it's one of those things where it wasn't moving, but the optical illusion caused it to move. And so therefore it had a really negative effect on me that nobody else would have ever probably anticipated. So when we give users control, it means we have to give them enough time to interact with the content.
So that you might be asking, well, what is enough time?
Well, each user is going to vary. So instead of us having a guessing game to say, well, is it 10 seconds, 15 seconds? It's all about giving controls to the user so that they can control it. So we want to let them be able to pause and stop and hide content that's maybe moving or flashing or blinking around. It's too bad wallpaper can't have a pause button. Our third principle tells us that we need to make our content readable and understandable. So we've talked a lot about like development frameworks and UI elements that exist, but the content is actually the heart of accessibility because people consume content in a variety of ways, and we need to be flexible to kind of accommodate where their needs are. Not to mention that complex content is difficult to read for people and for robots.
Yes. Can you imagine? You probably think that, well, our clinicians, they deal with complex data every day.
But they have no idea what a database is. So if you pop open a little message and it says that there's been a big giant database error with a bunch of technical jargon in it, all they see is blah, blah, blah.
That's probably like where our members wouldn't necessarily understand what encounter is. So that probably means that we need to make all of our content meaningful for all of our users.
They need to be able to have it presented in their own kind of language.
So another thing that we have to be aware of is that we ensure that our content appears and operates in a predictable way. So that means there can't be flashing, scrolling, multiple windows being opening. Otherwise, our users could be very confused whether they have disabilities or not. It's also important that we avoid and prevent mistakes. Error prevention is a key component of understandable content. We're all human and we make mistakes. Even I do. One of the most common forms of preventing errors is a dialog box. So a dialog box is an immediate indication of an error in the context of the error. But in a really intense environment like healthcare, then an additional dialog might not be everything that they need. They also need to have error prevention. So when I talk about error recovery, I'm also talking about something like form validation. So form validation, we commonly see for an accessible individual, something like this, where you have a banner with the main error problem and multiple different errors. That way the user can find the error in the context of the content, as well as multiple errors on the screen.
I don't know about you guys, but there's nothing more irritating when a website says, hey, there's an error, and then you have to go hunting for it. It makes it really difficult to speed through stuff. So our last principle is about being robust, and that means that we need to make our content future-friendly.
So there's a wide variety of assistive technologies, from braille readers to screen magnification to voice speech recognition, such as Dragon Speaking.
Or Siri. Siri would be a good example.
So it wasn't that long ago when WCAG first published their standards, and WCG in 1999 was actually before there were mobile devices or websites.
I mean, the technology landscape back in 1999, I don't know who was, I hope most of you were alive by that time. So, I mean, Google had just launched, the late of 1998. Everybody was freaking out over Y2K.
Boy, were they freaking out.
And this wasn't even a thought. Nobody was even thinking about that because we were all carrying around these guys. You guys remember these? I mean, the faceplates were the bomb. Diggity.
Faceplates.
That was high tech back then. But now, look at the landscape of technology. It's almost natural for us to think about our content as we're crafting our solutions, how it moves and changes inside the ever-changing form factor of all of these devices.
So being future-friendly doesn't mean that we have to keep up with technology, though.
So we don't have to keep up with the Joneses, is what you're saying?
No.
Okay, that's good.
It's just a matter of remembering a couple of basics. And when I mean basics, I mean things like writing valid code.
That sounds pretty logical.
Optimizing your navigation. Using standard controls and content, and staying away from known accessibility hazards.
So, pretty basic stuff.
Pretty basic.
Keeping it simple. Have you ever heard of Robson Square?
That's in Canada, right?
Vancouver, Canada. Check it out. You guys see a little zigzag pattern going on in there? Any guesses? It's actually the wheelchair ramp. And it looks pretty awesome. It's kind of a great example to show that when you think about accessibility from the beginning and you plan it into the design, it actually becomes something really quite beautiful. So we've covered perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, the kind of 4 tenet principles that help us understand legislation and all of the regulatory standards that exist out there. That's kind of their goal. But the key to crafting these compelling, awesome experiences across the variety of users that we have, that equality of experience is through something known as universal design. And universal design is the design and composition of buildings, products and services so that they can be accessed, understood, and used by everybody. It's kind of an accessible approach, an inclusive approach to design.
So it's as simple as accessibility. When folks usually think of it, they think of it as just being part of a tiny piece of UI design, or just a checkbox to complete at the end of development. When in fact, it's more than screen design. It's about the users and their environment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as you can tell, we're pretty passionate about accessibility, from friends with low vision to relatives with limited mobility. It's almost like accessibility is designing for the you of the future. It means paying attention to all of the senses.
So kind of a key to remember is whenever you're developing content, designing, creating, how would a user read or consume your content if they couldn't see it? How would they if they couldn't hear it? What extra things do you need to do for a user who's unable to touch in the interface if you have a touch device? Or if they're unable to use voice commands? Like, what does that even look like? So if you start thinking about and slicing it up that way, it's going to help you compensate for each of the individual needs. Accessibility really is a point of innovation. I know just in my history of working with accessibility, a lot of people assume that it's like weighing you down. It's like this ball and chain that you have to carry around with you. Because it is difficult to understand sometimes.
It's not a minefield.
But it isn't a minefield. In fact, accessibility leads to greater usability because if it is accessible, it's going to have higher usability scores and you're going to ensure that everyone's going to be able to use it. So as you guys leave here today, we would like you to consider that in a universe filled with possibilities, it should be possible for everybody to experience them. And one of the greatest experiences that we've ever had kind of working within accessibility is watching people with disabilities leverage technology. It is really eye-opening, and so we wanted to kind of share an experience with you today. So we're going to leave you with this.
If there's a photo in my feed, I should be able to know who's in it. In
November
this
2nd,
particular
2015. Link,
case,
iOS.
all he said about his
Shared with
picture,
public, but I need bail money ASAP.
I need bail money as soon as possible. Yeah, okay, that doesn't surprise me, Scott. So let's see what the voiceover says here.
This image may contain one or more people, outdoor, motorcycle, link, image.
I set up my account in 2009 before the accessibility team existed. It took me several hours to do what probably would have taken somebody else like 15 or 20 minutes. Even back then, what people were doing was posting pictures and talking about it. So you feel really excluded if you can't see the picture. But this is a problem that as machines get smarter, that machines can solve. It was 1986 when I first started using a screen reader. I was an electrical engineering student. Of course, I didn't want to just use them. I started tinkering with them and giving their developers my opinions right away and figuring out how to try to make them better. And I did that same kind of thing as soon as I got to IBM. Was actually an early leader in screen reading technology and IBM research. I got to know the people in IBM research. So this is what the very first baby steps we're taking, is what we're demonstrating here. The ability to have our systems recognize objects in a photo and then put that together in some sort of meaningful description. In this particular case,
Link, September 14th, 2015.
my friend Shoshana updated her profile picture.
Public, link, image. This image may contain one person, smiling.
And I had no idea what she posted. It could have been anything, not necessarily her, but our system told me the photo may contain one person who's smiling. It's really the idea that we're including everybody in the conversation, and we're essentially telling people with disabilities that each one of you matters. You're important. You matter as a part of this community. We want you to be part of the community. We want you to be able to feel included.
Thank you, guys.
So do you have any questions?
We do have some time left, so we have some microphones that have been strategically placed. If you want to come and ask some questions, you are more than welcome. Yes, Damien. No, you're not on yet. There you are.
There we go. I was curious, in your guys' experience, what are some of the most common mistakes you see from a design and development community alike that detract from the accessibility of a solution?
So on the design side, back in kind of the early 2000s, designers were really quick to customize like a checkbox. Remember all the custom checkboxes where it's more of like an image and you have to toggle the states of the images? And basically what that does from a development side is it means to keep it accessible, you have to hide the input field way over here, and you have to have all of the visual representation over here. And it's just a lot of extra work that because you didn't use a standard component, if new technology actually comes in, it's immediately going to break. So it's, from the design side, it's basically over-designing. Becca, do you have anything from the development side or anything?
Most commonly, we're kind of seeing this new trend for using ARIA, which is ARIA, which helps support that content and structure, the back-end structure of our websites. And so there's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding of how to use that, so that's kind of where we see kind of the new frontier of accessibility.
Are there any really simple things that you guys catch all the time that people can take away from this? I know Becca and Amber, you both talked about alt tags and those types of things. Is there any simple things that people can very easily remember from this talk?
If you have a link and it says click here, that's not going to be accessible. So make sure that you describe where the user's going for both the cited and the non-cited user. Click here to access something. And then when you get back into the alt text of it, you're clicking here, or it's a link to access whatever it's going to be. So being as descriptive as possible, over communicating even at that point.
Using multiple forms of color coding to communicate your concepts, so don't just rely on red and green.
Thank you, guys.
Hi there.
Is it on?
Hi there.
I think you're on.
Okay, cool. I was wondering if off the top of your head you had any recommendations for publicly available books or guides on getting started in something involving the accessibility or writing accessible UI, for someone who otherwise has limited experience in UI design in general.
WebAIM has really great resources for getting started. That's where I started, was with some of the resources that WebAIM provides. And they're part of the W3C, WCAG type stuff, so pretty easy Google search there.
And considering that most of the regulatory bodies are now piggybacking onto WCAG, so take Section 508, wasn't it updated in 2008?
They're in the process of updating it again to more closely follow
WCAG. But a lot of times they'll just be and do what WCAG does, because WCAG is constantly improving, and that allows the governments to kind of be freed up from having to maintain all of that regulation. So that's why we talk a lot about WCAG, is because most everybody is following it already.
Cool. Thank you.
You might be on, Jason, I'm not sure. Nope, not yet. Yeah, you should just come this way. Jason Kennedy, everybody.
Yes. By the way, you're not quite 4 years. 27th, right? Isn't that when we?
Say that one more time.
The 27th, I think, was when we
August
started.
27th
Yeah, there you
was
go.
my start date.
Compass Group. It was 20 of us left.
High five.
So my question is, we have a lot of teams that have gotten a lot of development under their belt and probably are going, wow, this is really cool, but how in the world do we get there? So what is the process from where most of us are to starting down this path of adopting accessibility? Yeah.
So we have an accessibility team here at Cerner. I'd like to introduce everybody to Kim Easterhouse. Stand up, Kim. So if you guys have any questions about where to start, Kim is working actually with Becca really closely with all of the DoD project that's going on and kind of understanding where all of our solutions, like what level of accessibility they have to meet. So she's going to be your go-to gal.
There's also a Usern group that provides a lot of background information on how to get started, what tools you need from a developer perspective, that kind of thing.
Welcome. Anybody else?
First of all, you guys are doing an amazing job for the user experience, and like you're making actually the development process really accessible for the actual users out there. But I have a question: do you have like problems making design choices when you are making it usable as well as interactive? Because there are a lot of new interactive websites out there, but are they usable for people with disabilities?
So on the design side, I actually find accessibility standards very freeing. And that's because design tends to be very subjective. I don't know how many of you guys have a design background, but somebody may like it and somebody may not like it. So you have differing opinions. I mean, Google even took about how many, like 80 blues? Did they do some testing around for their hyperlink colors? I find that accessibility regulations help kind of narrow the focus down, and so then you have a toolbox ready to go. So like colors as an example, how many times can you go over with a different color blue? Well, let's just make sure that it hits the official accessibility mark, and then let's make decisions from there. So I actually really enjoy having them help put a box around from a creative standpoint.
So basically, like, make it accessible first and then make it interactive on the top.
And then do all of your small tweaks, because accessibility is beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else? You're all hungry? Yeah. I saw them like putting out all of the boxes. So it's all downstairs. So if you guys want to go grab some lunch, we'll see you later.
Thank you.